The summer sun had arrived in Flaxborough with its usual civil indifference. Not so warm as to encourage lounging on lawns, nor so harsh as to raise anyone's temper, it cast a polite glow over the town's annual flower show. The marquee, newly polished, sat in the market square like a conscientious servant awaiting inspection, its bunting taut and cheerful. Flaxborough residents milled about, clutching entry forms and teacups with equal solemnity, nodding to acquaintances with the gravity of small-town diplomacy. At the heart of the proceedings, Mrs. Caldecott, president of the Floral Society, moved with the ceremonial diligence of a general inspecting troops. She peered over the rows of dahlias and marigolds with a critical eye, murmuring, "Oh yes, well, passable, I suppose," to herself, though the young entrants interpreted this as high praise. Behind her, Mr. Thistle, the town's amateur horticulturalist and occasional bore, fretted over his prize-winning dahlias, muttering into the folds of his waistcoat about the scandalous neglect of sunlight. Inspector Purbright, on the other hand, had arrived not for flowers but for observation, a pastime he found almost as satisfying as reading the obituaries. He stood by the refreshments table, precisely equidistant from the entrance and the display, surveying the scene with his habitual calm, polite attention. His hands were folded neatly behind his back, and his expression was one of faint curiosity, the sort that made people speak without realizing they were revealing more than they intended. The peculiar incident of the day occurred quietly, almost politely, at precisely 10:15. It was Miss Cresswell, Flaxborough's florist with a sharp tongue and a habit of trimming anyone who dared call her roses anything less than exemplary, who noticed it first. A handkerchief, folded with mathematical precision, lay on the central display table. There was nothing intrinsically remarkable about a handkerchief in a town accustomed to such items, until Miss Cresswell noted the initials embroidered upon it. R.S. "Oh, my stars," she murmured, though under her breath. "Not that R.S." The words barely carried to anyone else, yet Mrs. Caldecott, with her sense of decorum finely tuned to catch scandal, overheard. She stiffened and raised an eyebrow, a movement so deliberate that the effect was almost theatrical. Immediately, a subtle ripple passed through the adjacent exhibitors. Mrs. Penrose, who ran the local haberdashery, whispered to her neighbour about the improbability of R.S. appearing in Flaxborough's social scene without note. Purbright noted the ripple as one might note the course of a small boat disturbed by a gentle current. He made no move toward the handkerchief. It was best to allow the town to react first, to observe the social temperature before intervention. "Did anyone see who left this?" Miss Cresswell asked, loud enough that several heads turned. Her voice carried the faintly accusatory tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The crowd, polite and uneasy, shuffled. Mr. Thistle adjusted his monocle and offered, "I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, though one cannot discount the possibility of misplacement." "Misplacement, indeed," Mrs. Caldecott said crisply, placing her gloved hand on the table. "No one simply leaves their handkerchief on a prize-winning dahlias table without intention." She glanced at Purbright, whose neutral expression gave nothing away. The inspector's presence, however, had a calming effect. People tended to forget their own alarm, or at least curtail it in his company. He cleared his throat softly, the sound barely above the murmur of the town gossip, yet possessing a subtle weight. "Perhaps it is prudent to examine whose handkerchief this is," he suggested, in that unhurried manner which encouraged cooperation, without embarrassment. Naturally, speculation ran rampant. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Higginbottom, suggested the initials might belong to Reginald Squires, the retired solicitor, recently seen in town purchasing seed packets and arguing over the precise depth for planting tulips. Another posited it could be Rosamond Sinclair, heiress to the Flaxborough textile fortune, known to be in the area for charitable purposes and, more importantly, prone to dramatic gestures. Miss Cresswell sniffed. Reginald Squires? Pah! The man hasn't attended a flower show in decades. It's clearly someone attempting to create a scene. The crowd, who had so far treated the flower show as an exercise in polite conformity, now buzzed with gentle disapproval and excitement. It was astonishing how a mere handkerchief could unravel the afternoon's serenity. Purbright made a quiet note. In Flaxborough, a minor object could magnify a person's sense of grievance far beyond its intrinsic significance. More importantly, people rarely stated their motives openly, they revealed them in tone, hesitation, and posture. "I should like to see the table untouched," he said next, carefully directing his attention toward Mrs. Caldecott. "No one should handle anything until I have had the opportunity to observe." "Of course, Inspector," Mrs. Caldecott replied, her tone a mixture of relief and indignation, as if she had been waiting all her life for someone to assert such control. Purbright moved a few steps closer to the handkerchief, studying it from a distance. It was impeccably clean, precisely folded, and entirely out of place among the faintly dusty and sun-wilted petals. He noted the embroidery, neat, conservative, with the slight flourish of a person accustomed to claiming their property in formal circumstances. He did not yet know whether it was evidence of a crime or merely the product of social eccentricity, but he had already made a small private deduction. Someone in the town had deliberately left this item to be discovered. The question of why would require patience and subtle questioning. As the initial ripples of gossip circulated, Miss Cresswell whispered urgently to her neighbour about possible theft, Mr. Thistle speculated on competitive sabotage, and Mrs. Caldecott ordered the ushers to keep spectators clear. Purbright, meanwhile, continued his observation with quiet diligence. He noticed the way certain onlookers tilted their heads, the rapid glances exchanged between Mrs. Penrose and the younger ladies, and the barely perceptible tightening of Mr. Higginbottom's jaw. Every subtle movement was a clue, every polite remark a potential lie. And above it all, the handkerchief remained folded on the table, silent, yet insistently significant. By the time the first tea tray was emptied, the story had begun to take shape in Purbright's mind. Not the full story, of course, but the outline of human pretense, rivalry, and expectation that would eventually lead him to the truth. Flaxborough's genteel surface, so carefully maintained, had been perturbed by something as innocuous as linen with initials, and that perturbation would, in due course, reveal more than anyone anticipated. For now, however, the inspector merely sipped his tea, made a polite inquiry about the strength of the milk, and allowed the citizens of Flaxborough to demonstrate their very human tendency to speculate before knowing. A handkerchief had never caused such a stir, and Purbright, as ever, observed in silence, noting the peculiar ways that small-town civility masked tiny but telling transgressions. The flowers could wait, human nature could not. By mid-morning, the flower show had evolved into something resembling a court of gentle scrutiny, with the handkerchief incident as its unexpected centerpiece. Word of the embroidered linen had spread faster than the aroma of Mrs. Tilling's scones, each retelling adding a hint of intrigue or disapproval. Miss Cresswell, sensing the dramatic potential of the situation, moved among the tables with the authority of a town crier. "Imagine," she whispered to anyone who would listen, "someone so bold as to leave Reginald Squire's handkerchief in public." Her words carried the faintly scandalous implication that anyone associated with R.S. was now under moral suspicion. The younger exhibitors giggled, careful not to offend, while the more senior ladies exchanged glances that mixed curiosity with a sense of procedural caution. Purbright, observing from the edge of the marquee, noted the subtle shifts in posture and attention. Gossip, he knew, was a kind of human weather, sometimes a gentle breeze, sometimes a storm that uproots everything it touches. It was the shape of the human mind under social pressure that interested him far more than the flower displays themselves. Mrs. Penrose had stationed herself by the dahlias, feigning interest in the blooms while covertly eavesdropping on the more dramatic accounts of the handkerchief's appearance. She had an almost ritualistic need to comment on events, a habit that often revealed her own anxieties. "It's clearly some attempt at intrigue," she murmured to Mrs. Caldecott. "Or perhaps a joke by those horrid squire's children. I've never trusted them." Across the marquee, Mr. Thistle muttered to a small cluster of admirers that such an incident was likely the result of carelessness rather than any deliberate act. "Though," he added cautiously, "the timing is suspicious, perfectly timed for maximum effect on the social register." He peered at the handkerchief through his monocle, squinting as though subtle embroidery could divulge the secrets of human intent. Even the exhibitors who initially ignored the handkerchief found themselves drawn into discussion. Young Master Harper, with a modest vase of violets, confessed that he had glimpsed a shadowy figure moving near the central table earlier, but could not identify them. "It might have been the wind," he suggested hesitantly, uncertain whether to invoke the supernatural or accept human interference. The notion of wind interference was quietly dismissed by the adults, though the hesitation in the boy's voice piqued Purbright's interest. Children, he knew, often perceived more than they were willing or permitted to articulate. By 11 o'clock the tea-table had become an arena for whispered conjecture. Mrs. Caldecott, now fully engaged in managing both flowers and social equilibrium, subtly guided the conversations, nodding approvingly when her preferred interpretations were offered. She seemed to thrive on the dual responsibility of maintaining order and allowing just enough intrigue to give her authority meaning. Purbright, silently refilling his cup, observed the exchanges. He noticed the rhythm of speech, the micro-pauses when someone was uncertain, the way people avoided meeting certain gazes. Mr. Higginbottom, who had initially suggested Reginald Squires as a possible origin of the handkerchief, now appeared troubled, as though uncertain whether his own comment might spark offence. A faint frown creased his brow when Miss Creswell approached him, her expression sharpened with investigative curiosity. In the midst of the tea-fueled speculation, the handkerchief itself remained untouched on the central table, a small, folded provocation, neutral, yet potent. It seemed to gather attention like a magnet, pulling disparate threads of conversation toward it. Purbright found the human response more revealing than the object itself. Every whisper, glance, and polite interjection was data, though of a kind rarely collected by formal means. A subtle argument emerged concerning the motive behind the handkerchief's appearance. Mrs. Penrose insisted it was a message, a test of decorum or vigilance, while Miss Creswell considered it an insult to the floral order, a deliberate attempt to provoke embarrassment. Even the children joined in offering fanciful explanations, a secret admirer, a lost bet, or some clandestine espionage related to the baking contest. Purbright, as ever, allowed these ideas to circulate without correction. His attention was focused on noting contradictions rather than imposing clarity. The man who makes himself too visible often becomes a target for exaggeration. The silent observer, however, sees how truth creeps into the smallest gestures. It was shortly after this that a new character entered the scene. Mr. Linton, proprietor of the town's modest stationery shop, who was known for his meticulous record-keeping and penchant for unsolicited advice. He approached the Marquis with a slight limp, adjusting his bowler hat and carrying an air of officious curiosity. "Good morning," he began, addressing Mrs. Caldecott and, incidentally, anyone within earshot. "I hear there's some anomaly regarding the exhibits." He glanced at the central table, giving the handkerchief a deliberate once-over. Might I be of assistance in determining its provenance? The crowd, encouraged by his presence, leaned in. Mr. Linton's suggestions were precise, analytical, almost comically formal. He proposed a series of speculative investigations, comparing handwriting, checking the florist's delivery lists, cross-referencing attendees with prior society events. Each proposal was met with polite murmurs, some of admiration, some of thinly concealed irritation. Purbright watched carefully. Mr. Linton's methodical approach, while outwardly rational, hinted at personal curiosity, perhaps even opportunism. The inspector filed this mental note with others. The teller of facts might also be the seeker of advantage. By midday, the town's discussion had formed distinct factions, those convinced of deliberate mischief, those attributing the incident to coincidence, and a small minority quietly wondering whether the handkerchief was in fact a cipher for some more elaborate scheme. Each faction revealed itself through posture, choice of words, and the delicate avoidance of eye contact. The flower show proceeded in fits and starts, punctuated by murmurs and furtive observations. The dahlias remained immaculately arranged, the violets faithfully scented the air, and the teacups were refilled with the relentless efficiency of Flaxborough's domestic staff. Yet beneath this calm, a social storm brewed, contained by civility but potent in implication. Purbright, concluding his observations for the moment, walked the perimeter of the Marquis, greeting exhibitors with quiet courtesy while cataloguing their reactions. Each smile, each nod, each subtle twitch of an eyebrow was a piece of the larger puzzle. He knew that the handkerchief was only the beginning. Human nature, he reflected, was infinitely more complex than embroidered linen. By the time the sun shifted to illuminate the northern end of the square, the handkerchief had acquired a reputation of its own. It was no longer merely an object. It had become a symbol, a test of social navigation, and a catalyst for revealing character. Purbright, walking back to the refreshments table, made a small mental note to inquire discreetly about any visitors from outside town, about recent disputes, and about every whispered remark he had overheard. The scene was set. The town had spoken, the social dynamics were in motion, and the inspector, patient as ever, waited for the subtle signals that would eventually guide him toward clarity. The morning's excitement gradually subsided, leaving the Marquis suffused with the faint scent of tea, polished wood, and slightly sun-warmed flowers. Most attendees had resumed polite observation of the displays, but the undercurrent of speculation regarding the handkerchief lingered like a subtle perfume, detectable only to those who cared to notice. Purbright, with his customary patience, seized the opportunity to make preliminary inquiries. He did so not by interrogating anyone in a formal manner, but by engaging in casual conversation that encouraged truth to reveal itself through tone, hesitation, and choice of words. His first stop was the young Miss Harper, whose violets had drawn quiet admiration. "Quite an exquisite arrangement," he remarked, nodding at her display. "And you were near the central table earlier, I believe?" She shifted on her heels, glancing at the handkerchief with faint anxiety. "Yes, sir," she said, voice pitched just above whisper. I saw someone leaning over the table, but I couldn't see their face properly. They moved quickly." Purbright noted her careful phrasing. "Someone, rather than a person I know," which suggested either uncertainty or a polite concealment of observation. Moving along, he spoke with Mrs. Penrose. Her florid expression hinted at a mix of indignation and excitement. "You understand, Inspector," she said. "It is quite improper for such things to occur at a society function. One hopes it is not a deliberate attempt at scandal." Purbright responded with his mildest inflection, making no judgment. "Indeed, sometimes the most trivial items can carry unexpected weight." Mrs. Penrose nodded, clearly understanding his point, yet unable to resist adding, "Though one must consider that even trivialities might reveal character." At the refreshments table, Mr. Linton, the stationery proprietor, was cataloguing the handkerchief in his mind as if preparing a ledger entry. Purbright approached him casually. "You observed the handkerchief closely?" he inquired, keeping the question open-ended. Mr. Linton's eyes brightened, but he maintained a veneer of discretion. "I did. Its embroidery is very precise, almost meticulous. One would think the owner takes great care with personal items." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, refraining from any suggestion of motive. He wanted to let Linton over-interpret the significance himself. Miss Cresswell, meanwhile, had resumed her rounds, though she lingered near Purbright, perhaps hoping his presence would lend authority to her interpretations. "I cannot fathom why anyone would do such a thing," she said, frowning at the handkerchief. "Unless—" She hesitated, as though weighing the social repercussions of voicing her suspicion. Purbright merely inclined his head slightly, silently encouraging her to speak. "Unless it is a message," she finished, lowering her voice. Purbright noted the subtle modulation in her speech. Her choice to allow the suggestion of a message rather than asserting it as fact indicated both caution and an awareness of gossip's social potency. He committed the nuance to memory alongside the expressions and reactions of others who had glanced in her direction. A few steps further, he encountered Mr. Higginbottom, still frowning slightly, as though inwardly debating whether his earlier remarks had been imprudent. "I simply mentioned Reginald Squires," he said defensively, "though I did not intend any imputation of misconduct." Purbright offered a polite, neutral smile. "Of course, sometimes the mention of names is sufficient to prompt curiosity, if nothing else." Mr. Higginbottom's nod was curt, almost relieved, and he adjusted his waistcoat in a manner suggesting a return to propriety. Purbright then returned to the central table, where the handkerchief lay folded, utterly indifferent to the social currents swirling around it. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, considering the town's reaction thus far. The pattern was familiar, a minor anomaly prompted speculation, which revealed character and interpersonal dynamics in a way formal questioning rarely could. By now, the more inquisitive attendees had begun to notice that the inspector was taking a discreet interest in small details, the slight smudge on a petal, a nervous glance exchanged between acquaintances, the subtle displacement of a teacup. Each movement, each hesitation, was a potential clue, though none were yet connected to motive or identity. Purbright catalogued them with the meticulous patience that had long served him in Flaxborough. A minor disturbance drew his attention. A young man, unfamiliar to the core of town society, approached the marquee with a portfolio under his arm. He introduced himself as Mr. Archer, a visiting journalist covering the flower show for a regional paper. His interest in the handkerchief was immediate, almost too immediate. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, though his eyes scanned the table with eager calculation. Purbright made no response, allowing Mr. Archer to speak at length about the potential scandal and the human interest angle, all the while observing which attendees paid him undue attention or subtly recoiled. By noon, Purbright had completed his preliminary inquiries with the principal actors, the florists, the stationery proprietor, the exhibitor families, and the few outside observers. Each conversation revealed something different. A slight overstatement here, a minor omission there, a glimmer of pride or anxiety. Most telling were the contradictions, small and polite, embedded in otherwise unremarkable exchanges. It was then, while sampling another cup of tea and noting a faint smudge of jam on a napkin, that Purbright reflected on the social mechanics at play. The handkerchief, he mused, was less important than the collective reaction to it. It was a mirror reflecting the subtle hierarchies, petty ambitions, and latent rivalries that comprised Flaxborough's quiet society. That insight, he suspected, would provide the key to understanding not just the handkerchief's presence, but the motivations behind it. By mid-afternoon, the flower show was winding down, though the social tension persisted like a low murmur beneath the polite laughter. Miss Cresswell had resumed her rounds with renewed vigilance. Mr. Linton appeared busier than ever cataloguing events in his mind, and Mrs. Penrose continued to offer quiet admonitions to anyone straying from the proper observances. Purbright, for his part, made his final round of the day. He observed the subtle alignments of people, noted who avoided whom, and quietly registered the micro-expressions that might later indicate concealment or exaggeration. The town had spoken through whispers, glances, and polite disagreement, and he had listened. By the time the last teacups were cleared, Purbright had a collection of observations, contradictions, and subtle hints sufficient to begin connecting threads. He had not yet revealed any of his own suspicions, nor had he allowed anyone to perceive the trajectory of his thinking. That, he knew, was a luxury reserved for later, when human nature had fully exposed itself and the handkerchief's significance could be weighed against the personalities it had momentarily unsettled. Flaxborough returned outwardly to its accustomed order. Flowers were admired, scones consumed, and teacups polished. Yet beneath the calm, the social currents stirred in new directions, carrying with them the seeds of quiet intrigue. And Purbright, ever patient, remained at the heart of observation, cataloguing each subtle gesture and unspoken thought, ready for the moment when the pieces would begin to assemble into something more coherent. By the following morning, Flaxborough had fully assimilated the handkerchief incident into its social consciousness. Conversations at the bakery, the post office, and the market square were lightly tinctured with speculation, yet conducted with an air of civility that the town prized above all else. Purbright, arriving at his modest office in the police station, reviewed his notes from the flower show, mentally cataloguing the observations and minor contradictions he had recorded. The object itself, the neatly folded linen with its initials, had yet to reveal its purpose, but human reactions to it were already beginning to outline a pattern. The first obvious suspect emerged almost inevitably. Reginald Squires, recently returned from a fortnight in Eastbourne, had been sighted near the marquee by multiple townspeople, each account slightly different yet converging on the same conclusion. He had lingered unusually long by the central table during the morning's activity. Mrs. Caldecott, who maintained a vigilant awareness of social proprieties, expressed concern that his proximity might be interpreted as evidence of intent. Purbright, however, noted her emphasis on perception rather than fact, understanding that the town often conflated coincidence with deliberate action. Squires himself appeared perfectly composed, though with the faintest trace of discomfort beneath his polished exterior. He acknowledged the handkerchief politely, explaining that it was indeed his, carried habitually in his coat pocket, and that its sudden appearance on the table was likely the result of a slip as he adjusted his waistcoat while admiring the dahlias. The explanation was plausible, but Purbright observed the subtle way Squire's eyes flicked toward certain individuals, as though gauging their reactions, and the almost imperceptible stiffening of his posture when mentioning the handkerchief's misplacement. The townspeople, however, were not so easily persuaded. Mrs. Penrose, ever vigilant for deviations from propriety, whispered to a small cluster of neighbours that Squire's behaviour was curiously attentive, implying calculation rather than accident. Miss Cresswell, equally invested in moral order, suggested that even if unintentional, the incident might constitute a breach of decorum requiring social admonishment. The remarks were framed politely, yet they carried a sting beneath the veneer of civility. Purbright chose to let these assessments circulate, making no effort to confirm or contradict them publicly. Observation, he knew, was most effective when the subject was unaware of the attention paid to nuances. Squire's account would stand or fall not on confrontation, but on the accumulation of subtle details, each a potential indicator of intent, consistency, or concealment. As he proceeded with inquiries, Purbright visited Mrs. Caldecott at her residence, ostensibly to discuss organizational matters for the upcoming summer fair. She welcomed him with her customary blend of warmth and scrutiny, eager to present herself as cooperative, while simultaneously testing the limits of his attentiveness. "I must confess, Inspector," she said, placing a cup of tea on the lace-draped table, "the handkerchief has caused quite a stir. People are far too imaginative for their own good." "Imagination often reveals more than facts alone," Purbright replied mildly, carefully allowing the comment to suggest reflection rather than judgment. Mrs. Caldecott smiled, perhaps sensing that he understood her concern without needing it articulated explicitly. Later he paid a visit to Mr. Thistle, who insisted upon demonstrating the precise alignment of his prize dahlias and commenting with some indignation upon the potential scandal of a handkerchief being left near the displays. "It reflects poorly," he said, "on the meticulous efforts of exhibitors who adhere to proper standards." Purbright listened, noting the distinction between genuine concern for horticultural standards and a more personal irritation regarding social reputation. The dual motivations, carefully interlaced, provided a subtle complexity that was characteristic of Flaxborough's social fabric. By mid-afternoon, Squires himself was summoned, politely and without urgency, to the police station for a brief conversation. He arrived punctually, hat in hand, acknowledging Purbright with courteous restraint. The discussion was civil, marked by Squire's careful explanations and Purbright's measured responses. Every detail, from the precise manner of folding the handkerchief to his recollection of moments spent near the marquee, was examined with gentle probing rather than accusation. Squires, confident in his own propriety, believed that clarity would emerge naturally, unaware of the subtleties being registered by the inspector. He spoke of his admiration for the flowers, the warmth of the day, and his general surprise at the attention the handkerchief had attracted. Purbright listened quietly, asking occasional clarifying questions, noting the slight variations in phrasing and hesitation that suggested awareness of potential misinterpretation. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued to speculate. At the post office, the butchers and the local tobacconist, the same story circulated, each iteration embellishing certain details, softening others. By evening, Squires had acquired the mantle of probable perpetrator, a designation born more from social conjecture than evidence. Purbright, however, withheld judgment, understanding that the superficial neatness of a suspect often concealed deeper complexities, contradictions, or unforeseen variables. Even as the day ended, small details continued to surface. Miss Harper mentioned, almost in passing, that she had seen another figure, a woman with a straw hat, near the central table at the same time as Squires, yet no one had paid much attention to her. The observation was fleeting, tentative, and easily dismissed, but Purbright filed it quietly, recognizing the potential significance of what the town had overlooked in favor of an obvious narrative. By nightfall, the town had returned to its routines, lamps lit, shutters drawn, and households preparing for dinner with the unspoken acknowledgment that scandal had occurred, though its full resolution remained uncertain. Purbright remained at his desk, reviewing his notes, tracing connections between gestures, pauses, and statements. He considered the interplay between public perception and private action, aware that Flaxborough's civility often masked motives that were as intricate as they were understated. Thus, the first suspect had emerged naturally through coincidence, observation, and social scrutiny, yet the inspector knew that the apparent solution was rarely the true one. The handkerchief, innocuous to most, had revealed the town's inclinations, pressures, and assumptions. Purbright, patient and precise, was content to allow appearances to crystallize while continuing to observe, trusting that the accumulation of small, seemingly trivial details would ultimately expose a more complex reality. The morning brought a quiet clarity to Flaxborough, the kind that allows small irregularities to become more conspicuous than any dramatic incident. Purbright, walking along the cobbled streets toward the market, noted that the social atmosphere had shifted subtly. The town had largely settled on Reginald Squires as the central figure of curiosity, but beneath polite conversation there were hints of unrest, of questions that did not fit neatly into the tidy narrative of coincidence. It was precisely these undercurrents that drew the inspector's attention more keenly than any loud pronouncement. By mid-morning he arrived at the Floral Society Hall, intending to review the layout of the displays and speak once more with the principal exhibitors. The hall was empty save for a few late arrivals, and Mrs. Caldecott, who had returned to oversee the careful restoration of order following the previous day's gossip. She greeted Purbright warmly, noting that the handkerchief had been safely returned to its owner, yet with an air of mild consternation that suggested the matter was far from settled in the collective imagination. Purbright's eye, trained for detail, immediately noted a slight misalignment in the display of prize-winning dahlias. One flower, a deep crimson, was subtly shifted, its stem tilted at an angle inconsistent with the otherwise meticulous arrangement. It was a minor anomaly, easily overlooked by anyone focused on more conspicuous elements, yet it drew his attention with the insistence of a whispered hint. He crouched slightly, examining the petals for signs of handling or disturbance. There were faint impressions, nearly imperceptible, suggesting that something had been moved, or perhaps had been placed there and removed in a measured fashion. Mrs. Penrose, observing from a respectful distance, commented on the arrangement, yet she seemed unaware that her casual remark might serve as confirmation of Purbright's suspicion that some minor but deliberate act had occurred. He noted the way her eyes lingered on certain details, betraying a subconscious awareness of their significance. It was then that Purbright's gaze shifted to a small shelf behind the refreshment table, where a collection of embroidered napkins and handkerchiefs was normally displayed for sale. One item, slightly out of alignment, bore the faintest trace of crimson, pollen. The colour was too precise to be accidental, and the position suggested it had been placed there recently, possibly as a means of concealment or distraction. The handkerchief itself, with its initials, had been handled, returned, and yet left this subtle trace unnoticed by anyone but him. The implication was clear. Someone had manipulated the display with a delicate, almost imperceptible intent. The action was trivial in scale but odd in purpose, signalling attention to detail and perhaps a desire to test the boundaries of perception. Purbright catalogued the observation carefully, making no outward display of his awareness, as the subtleties of the act were more telling than any explicit confession. As he examined the trace of pollen, the door opened, admitting Miss Creswell, who carried a small notebook in which she had evidently recorded observations of the day's events. She approached with her usual mixture of curiosity and propriety, noting the slight misalignment. "I thought perhaps the wind had shifted it," she offered, tentatively, glancing at Purbright for approval. The inspector inclined his head slightly, allowing her to interpret his acknowledgement as agreement, though his thoughts remained inwardly analytical. A few minutes later, Mr. Thistle entered, peering over his spectacles at the crimson flower and the shelf. "I cannot imagine why such a trivial displacement should matter," he said, though his voice betrayed a faint edge of uncertainty. "Certainly the flowers themselves remain unaffected." Purbright responded with measured calm. "Sometimes it is not the immediate effect that matters, but the intention behind an action." His words were neutral, yet pregnant with observation. Even as these interactions unfolded, the broader town resumed its rhythm outside the hall. Shopkeepers discussed the flower show in subdued tones. The postman lingered, remarking that he had noticed curious behavior near the marquee, and children whispered theories that were simultaneously imaginative and slightly exaggerated. The social web of Flaxborough continued to expand, each participant contributing subtle clues without realizing the larger pattern emerging. Purbright allowed himself a moment to consider human behavior. Small acts of misplacement, minor deviations from expected order, often carried the weight of personality, pride, or hidden grievance. The handkerchief had introduced the initial disruption, but this slight adjustment of the floral display suggested that someone remained engaged, testing reactions, or perhaps indulging in a quiet game of social observation. By late morning, he had gathered sufficient impressions to recognize that the first obvious suspect, Reginald Squires, while superficially implicated, was not necessarily the central figure in the current pattern. The trivial yet deliberate action revealed attention to subtlety and timing, qualities that did not align neatly with the earlier assumption of accidental misplacement. Purbright filed the observation carefully, noting that in Flaxborough, minor anomalies often concealed more than the obvious. A brief visit from Mrs. Caldecott concluded the morning's inquiries. She expressed mild concern for the integrity of the displays, yet her underlying intent was to maintain social cohesion, ensuring that no participant felt unfairly judged. Purbright responded with polite acknowledgement, inwardly noting that her concern was as much about perception as about petals. By midday, the hall was nearly empty. The small detail of the crimson flower and the slightly misaligned handkerchief was the only remnant of an otherwise orderly event, yet Purbright understood that such a trivial observation often held more significance than the most ostentatious act. The patterns of behavior, the timing, the unspoken messages, they all converged in ways that required patient accumulation and quiet interpretation. As he departed the hall, he reflected on the significance of triviality in human affairs. Minor gestures, misplaced objects, and seemingly inconsequential adjustments often revealed priorities, motives, and character far more clearly than overt actions. In Flaxborough, where civility and reputation were paramount, such subtleties were the key to understanding the underlying dynamics of any incident. Purbright's thoughts returned to the handkerchief, to the subtle misplacement of the crimson flower, and to the nuanced interactions he had witnessed. Each element, when considered in isolation, might seem negligible, yet together they suggested a carefully observed and deliberately enacted sequence, the purpose of which had yet to be fully revealed. He noted that patience, observation, and the willingness to detect the unspoken were essential in navigating the labyrinth of small-town behavior. By late afternoon, he had assembled a mental map of gestures, coincidences, and minor deviations, confident that the cumulative weight of these trivial yet telling observations would soon point toward a deeper understanding. The town remained outwardly serene, yet beneath the calm surface, the first threads of intrigue were quietly unraveling, setting the stage for further discovery. By the early days of the following week, Flaxborough had settled into its usual rhythms, yet the handkerchief incident lingered like a faint undertone beneath daily life. Purbright, with the meticulous patience that had become his hallmark, began expanding his inquiries beyond the immediate circle of flower show exhibitors. Small anomalies, he knew, rarely existed in isolation. The town's social fabric was interwoven with grudges, ambitions, and concealed peccadilloes, all waiting for a slight disturbance to reveal themselves. His first visit was to the railway buffet, a locale he had long considered a repository of useful observations. The station, with its perpetual scent of coal, varnished wood, and stale tea, offered a cross-section of Flaxborough society. As Purbright sipped a cup of tea, he noted the regulars, Mr. Linton poring over ledgers, a small group of clerks quietly discussing the flower show, and a stranger who appeared to be taking note of each conversation with a curious intensity. It was remarkable, Purbright thought, how even routine journeys could become revealing under the right gaze. At the bakery, the discussion was more animated. Mrs. Tilling, while kneading dough with her habitual precision, mentioned that Mr. Archibald, the local chemist, had asked curious questions about the flower show's scheduling and attendees. Purbright filed the remark discreetly. It was a minor observation, yet it suggested attention to detail and an interest in social patterns beyond the obvious. Even minor involvement in town events often betrayed more about character than the events themselves. The afternoon brought a visit to the small library where Miss Bramley, the librarian, provided a useful perspective. She had overheard conversations among young apprentices and visiting clerks, noting the faintly mischievous tone that suggested amusement at the handkerchief incident, coupled with speculation about motives. "They think it might be a jest, sir," she said, "though I suspect there is more subtlety involved." Purbright acknowledged her observation with a polite nod, appreciating that the younger participants were more candid in speech than their elders. Later, Purbright observed the town council as it convened in the modest chambers above the market hall. The discussion, ostensibly, about allotment regulations and market schedules included veiled references to the flower show and, indirectly, the handkerchief. Councillors spoke with a careful formality, but subtle indicators, slight glances, elongated pauses, and the careful choice of words suggested curiosity tinged with concern. It was clear that the event, trivial as it seemed, had rippled through multiple strata of the town's administration. Even the children contributed to the emerging picture. In the school playground, whispers of secret admirers, daring schemes, and the possibility of hidden notes circulated with increasing frequency. Purbright observed discreetly, noting the combination of creativity and mischief that might provide insight into broader patterns of behavior. The innocent imagination of youth, he reflected, often mimicked adult preoccupations in compressed form, revealing truths adults preferred to disguise. By evening, he had compiled a broad spectrum of observations. Each new character, Mr. Archibald, Miss Bramley, council members, and the visiting clerks, introduced potential avenues for investigation. None were overtly implicated, yet all demonstrated subtle curiosity, attention to social detail, or an inclination to note deviations from ordinary expectation. The handkerchief had become a catalyst, its presence prompting reflection, misinterpretation, and social maneuvering across the town. Returning to the police station, Purbright reviewed the accumulated impressions. Each individual, though initially peripheral, now formed part of a larger mosaic of behaviour. The initial focus on Reginald Squires had provided a convenient starting point, but the deeper picture suggested multiple layers of interest, minor actions, and intersecting motivations. Trivialities, such as a glance, an overheard remark, or an adjustment of posture, were now as significant as any overt statement. Purbright's reflections extended to the interplay of personality and circumstance. Flaxborough's residents were in many ways predictable in their social expectations, yet unpredictable in their private behaviour. The inconspicuous had often greater significance than the ostentatious, and subtlety, he knew, was frequently the most effective form of concealment. The handkerchief, the slight displacement of flowers, and the casual observations across the town all pointed to this underlying complexity. The inspector's method was deliberate. He did not yet confront or accuse, preferring to allow behaviours to reveal themselves in natural time. By broadening the field of observation, he increased the likelihood that inconsistencies, contradictions, or unexpected alignments would surface without forcing disclosure. Social currents, when left uninterrupted, often carried their own truths to the attentive observer. By nightfall, Purbright had mentally traced the threads connecting each person and action: the florist's vigilance, the station's casual scrutiny, council deliberations, the children's whispers, and the clerk's curiosity. Individually, each observation was minor. Collectively, they suggested patterns of interest and attention that might illuminate motive, timing, and opportunity. It was precisely the accumulation of small, ostensibly inconsequential details that would guide him toward understanding. As he prepared to leave the station, Purbright allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. The town's social fabric had revealed more than the flower show itself. Minor eccentricities, curiosities, and behaviors had provided a landscape of potential motives, timing, and subtle rivalry. Patience, observation, and meticulous attention to human behavior, qualities for which Flaxborough had long relied upon him, would, he knew, soon yield the clarity required. The handkerchief incident had begun as a minor disruption. Now, through the expansion of inquiries and observation across the town, it had illuminated a wider range of human interactions. Flaxborough, outwardly serene, had quietly revealed its layered complexity, and Purbright, ever patient, would allow the natural unfolding of events to provide the insights necessary to reach the truth. Flaxborough awoke that morning under a pale, diffused sunlight, which lent the market square an air of polite normality. Yet beneath the calm, subtle ripples of the handkerchief incident persisted, quietly colouring conversations in the bakery, the post office, and the council chambers. Purbright, arriving at the station, was already considering the next steps of his observation, but the day had another perturbation in store, something that would complicate the neat narrative the town had begun to weave around Reginald Squires. It was Mr. Linton, the meticulous stationer, who first drew attention to the anomaly. He had discovered a small parcel in the lobby of the Floral Society Hall, addressed in a precise, unfamiliar hand. The parcel contained a second handkerchief, again folded with mathematical care, this time embroidered with the initials M.R. It rested atop a stack of unopened correspondence, almost inviting discovery, but revealing nothing about its origin. Word spread quickly, though quietly, as townspeople had learned from previous experience to temper excitement with discretion. Mrs. Caldecott, while arranging chairs for a council meeting, whispered to Miss Cresswell about the parcel's arrival, hinting that a new layer of intrigue had arrived in the guise of a seemingly mundane object. Even the children, overhearing fragments of conversation in the schoolyard, speculated in muted tones that some secret network might be exchanging cryptic tokens across town. Purbright, summoned to inspect the parcel, examined it with patient care. The second handkerchief was of similar quality and size to the first, yet its embroidery suggested a different personality: sharper corners on the letters, a slightly more deliberate flourish. Its presence introduced a complication, one that suggested either coincidence or design, yet offered no direct evidence as to the messenger, motive, or intent. He noted the reactions of the surrounding adults. Mr. Thistle, adjusting his monocle, suggested with mild indignation that the Floral Society was being subjected to deliberate mischief. Mrs. Penrose posited that the handkerchief might be a test of decorum designed to provoke careful observation and gossip. Even Reginald Squires, who had arrived unexpectedly at the hall, exhibited a flicker of curiosity, though he maintained his composure with practiced civility. The dual appearance of handkerchiefs introduced the possibility of a pattern. Purbright considered timing, placement, and social reactions. The first item had generated immediate intrigue focused on a single suspect. This second item, however, expanded the potential circle of participants, suggesting subtle coordination or a broader interest in the town's perception. He allowed the implications to percolate, making no overt display of suspicion or analysis. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued their cautious speculation. Council members, previously concerned only with civic propriety, now debated whether some playful intervention or hidden rivalry had motivated the parcel's appearance. Miss Creswell, taking careful notes, documented the sequence of events, noting each participant's reaction and the way the parcel had subtly shifted focus from the original incident. Purbright observed that the second handkerchief, like its predecessor, functioned less as a physical object and more as a social catalyst. Reactions to it revealed hierarchy, priority, and personality. Those previously inclined to gossip now found additional avenues to display their perception, while others demonstrated restraint or curiosity, suggesting their own inclinations. Small gestures, a cleared throat, a sidelong glance, the careful folding of a napkin, became meaningful indicators when juxtaposed with the broader context. By midday, it became apparent that the second incident had realigned assumptions. Squires, previously a convenient focal point, now seemed less central. The introduction of new initials indicated that more than one participant might be involved, either in deliberate coordination or through independent coincidence. Purbright quietly catalogued the characteristics of the embroidery, the parcel's placement, and the subtle reactions it elicited, storing them for later comparison with prior observations. The Floral Society Hall, outwardly calm, had become a stage for nuanced social interplay. Visitors and regulars alike moved carefully, conscious that their interest, scrutiny, and even casual remarks were being noted. Purbright, remaining unobtrusive, allowed these interactions to occur naturally, recognizing that forced inquiry often produced obfuscation, while human behavior revealed truth in its unguarded form. By afternoon, whispers of a mystery correspondent circulated in low tones across the town. Shopkeepers, clerks, and postal workers began to speculate on connections, possible motives, and prior grievances. Purbright, considering these threads, noted that the apparent triviality of the object belied their capacity to illuminate social dynamics, relationships, and subtle rivalries. Even minor participants were instructive. Young Master Harper, still fascinated by the flower show, observed the parcel's arrival and reported details with careful precision, unaware that his account added another layer of clarity. Miss Bramley, the librarian, recorded second-hand observations from patrons, noting the careful attention paid to timing, reaction, and placement. Every small contribution, seemingly insignificant, now formed part of the larger lattice of evidence. Purbright reflected that Flaxborough, for all its civility, thrived on such understated interactions. The handkerchiefs were instruments of human revelation, offering insight into attentiveness, curiosity, and subtle ambition. The second incident, rather than resolving questions, had broadened the field, expanded potential suspects, and introduced nuances that demanded careful analysis. By evening, the town's social patterns had quietly adjusted. Residents moved with a new awareness, conscious that attention, however polite, had been trained upon minor behaviors and choices. The Floral Society Hall, still orderly, bore the silent imprint of curiosity and speculation. Purbright, reviewing his notes, recognized that the second incident had altered the trajectory of the inquiry. What had appeared obvious was now far more intricate, and the inspector's task of untangling motives and observing human nature had become both subtler and more compelling. As he left the hall, Purbright considered the implications. The dual handkerchiefs, trivial yet meticulously placed, had begun to reveal a network of observation, subtle rivalry, and concealed intention. Patience and measured attention would be essential. The first suspect's simplicity had been undermined by nuance, and the broader patterns of behavior would, in time, provide the insight necessary to uncover the underlying truth. The evening air in Flaxborough carried a gentle coolness, tinged with the faint aroma of coal smoke and freshly turned garden soil. Purbright sat alone in his office, the desk lamp casting a circle of warm light upon a meticulous array of notes, envelopes, and sketches. The two handkerchief incidents had settled into the town's social consciousness, yet for him the significance lay not in the objects themselves but in the interplay of human behavior they had revealed. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and allowed his thoughts to drift across the delicate lattice of observation he had constructed. He considered Reginald Squires the first convenient focal point. Squires' composure, polished manners, and slight attentiveness had initially suggested involvement, yet subtle discrepancies, hesitations, fleeting glances, and a faintly calculated posture had indicated something less than straightforward culpability. The second handkerchief, with its distinct initials and carefully placed position, suggested either a co-conspirator or an entirely different individual, one whose attention to detail rivaled or surpassed Squire's own measured comportment. Purbright reflected on the broader tapestry of Flaxborough. Mrs. Caldecott, with her blend of ceremonial authority and social sensitivity, was a master of influence without overt interference. Miss Creswell, young and eager, displayed a curious mixture of idealism and pragmatic observation. Mr. Linton, the stationer, approached events with methodical precision, noting details others overlooked, while Mr. Thistle contributed both a pedantic insistence on propriety and subtle indications of personal irritation. Each resident had revealed traits that were at once predictable and quietly revealing. It was the subtleties, he mused, that carried weight, the pause before a reply, the careful modulation of voice, the fleeting alignment of body and gaze. Human nature, he reminded himself, was rarely expressed in dramatic gestures. It preferred the understated, the almost imperceptible, and in such minor deviations lay the truth of intention. The handkerchiefs, trivial and inanimate, had acted as catalysts, provoking these small but instructive signals. Purbright's attention turned to timing. The first handkerchief appeared during the flower show, drawing immediate attention and social speculation. The second arrived days later, expanding the field of observation and subtly undermining the notion that a single individual had been responsible. He considered the interactions he had witnessed: children recounting glimpses, adults adjusting postures, council members exchanging cautious glances. Every moment, no matter how minor, had contributed to a growing lattice of potential insight. He pondered the psychology of concealment. Flaxborough's residents were adept at preserving outward civility, yet their private inclinations often betrayed themselves through micro-behaviors. A glance, a sigh, or an almost imperceptible stiffening could convey more about a motive than a direct statement. The townspeople's reactions to trivial provocations, observed dispassionately, provided a mirror to the values, prejudices, and latent ambitions that comprised the social fabric. Purbright reflected on the role of pride and reputation. In a town such as Flaxborough, where every gesture was noted and reported, the fear of social embarrassment shaped behavior as much as moral obligation. The handkerchiefs, though minor, threatened that equilibrium, and the ensuing reactions revealed priorities and sensitivities that that might otherwise have remained hidden. One could learn, he thought, more from the anxiety elicited by trivial objects than from overtly dramatic occurrences. He also considered cooperation and misdirection. Those who offered information freely often did so selectively, emphasizing details that supported their own interpretation, while omitting observations that might complicate the narrative. Conversely, those who withheld comment often revealed interest through posture, eye contact, or the careful avoidance of certain topics. The interplay of these behaviors, recorded patiently and without interruption, allowed the perceptive observer to discern patterns that would otherwise remain invisible. Another element concerned consistency over time. Purbright noted that repeated observations of the same individuals under different circumstances revealed discrepancies or confirmations of character. The subtle differences between reactions to the first and second handkerchiefs, Squire's composure, Miss Cresswell's eagerness, Mrs. Penrose's moral consternation, indicated that motivation could be inferred even when intent was carefully concealed. Time, patience, and attention amplified the clarity of human behavior. As he compiled these reflections, he recognized that the investigation had evolved beyond the handkerchiefs themselves. The objects were instruments of observation, prompts that had elicited revealing responses. What mattered was the nuanced combination of timing, action, and social context, the ways in which minor incidents could illuminate concealed ambitions, sensitivities, and alliances. Finally, Purbright considered the interplay of coincidence and design. The apparent triviality of the handkerchiefs could not obscure their effect. Each had elicited a cascade of behavior amplified by the town's interconnectedness. Whether deliberate or accidental, the incidents had functioned as a lens, magnifying character and motive. He made a quiet note to track subtle alignments, recurring glances, and minute discrepancies, recognizing that these would be essential when he eventually moved from observation to subtle intervention. By late evening, with the office quiet and the town settling into nocturnal calm, Purbright leaned back and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The field of observation was complete for now. Every subtle interaction, minor misplacement, and fleeting gesture had been catalogued. The handkerchiefs had done their work. The human fabric of Flaxborough, with all its quirks, contradictions, and concealed intentions, had been revealed in miniature, and the inspector knew that the next phase, careful testing of motives, gentle provocation, and polite confrontation, would bring the truth into sharper focus. Patience remained paramount. In Flaxborough, as ever, the most delicate threads often unravelled the deepest mysteries. By mid-morning, Flaxborough was returning to a semblance of routine, though subtle currents of anticipation lingered beneath polite conversation. Purbright, having reflected at length on the interplay of behaviour, timing, and social nuance, resolved that the next step required a deliberate, unobtrusive test, an intervention designed to elicit reactions rather than force admissions. He understood, as always, that human motives were rarely overt, and that the slightest provocation could reveal more than formal questioning ever could. He chose the Floral Society Hall for the exercise, arranging an ostensibly routine meeting to discuss forthcoming events. Exhibitors and townspeople arrived at the appointed time, each carrying a polite assumption that their presence was merely ceremonial. Purbright, occupying a central but unobtrusive position, allowed attendees to settle before introducing his gentle provocation, a casual remark regarding the handkerchiefs, framed as an aside rather than inquiry. "It occurs to me," he said, addressing the room without emphasis on any individual, "that these handkerchiefs, though trivial in themselves, have inspired remarkable observation and curiosity. One might wonder whether their placement was deliberate or purely accidental." His tone suggested reflection rather than accusation, yet the statement carried an almost imperceptible weight. The effect was immediate. Squires, seated at a polite distance, shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his cuffs and briefly avoiding eye contact with Purbright. Miss Cresswell, whose enthusiasm for minute detail was well known, leaned forward, pen poised over her notebook, eyes flicking between faces as if seeking confirmation of her suspicions. Mrs. Penrose straightened imperceptibly, adjusting her shawl with a faint tightening of the jaw. Even Mr. Thistle, whose concern for horticultural propriety had previously dominated his remarks, displayed a subtle but telling pause, hands tightening briefly over a notepad. Purbright allowed silence to extend, a soft, deliberate interval that encouraged self-revelation. Small gestures, micro-expressions, and minute hesitations carried greater meaning than words. He observed Squire's careful breathing, the repeated shifting of weight, and the barely perceptible glance toward the shelf where the first handkerchief had rested. Each movement, though superficially mundane, suggested heightened awareness and an effort to conceal anxiety. He continued, casually mentioning the floral arrangements. It is curious how attention to detail can reveal more than appearances alone. Even the smallest displacement of a bloom or the faintest trace of color might provoke reflection on intention. No one spoke, though eyes flickered and pens hovered over notes. Purbright's words were neutral, yet the room absorbed them as both observation and subtle probe, each listener revealing self-consciousness through posture and attention. The strategy was simple, a gentle nudge, allowing human nature to respond without coercion. Purbright noted that reactions were rarely uniform. Those seeking to conceal intent often overcompensated through exaggerated calm or attentiveness, while the genuinely innocent displayed either indifference or measured curiosity. The dual handkerchiefs, trivial yet precise, had now become instruments for observing these patterns. Miss Cresswell, unable to resist the combination of curiosity and civic responsibility, addressed the room. "Do we not risk misunderstanding, Inspector, if we presume design where chance might suffice?" Her phrasing was careful, polite, yet her glance toward Squires betrayed an anticipation of reaction. Squires offered a faint smile, neutral but tense, as though acknowledging propriety while internally negotiating composure. Purbright's attention shifted subtly to Mrs. Penrose. "Observation is rarely definitive in itself," he said lightly, "yet patterns emerge when we compare behavior over time. One might see repetition, hesitation, or avoidance that cumulatively suggests intention." Mrs. Penrose's lips pressed together, and she rearranged her gloves, a minor gesture betraying slight discomfort despite the polite attention she maintained. He allowed the conversation to drift to inconsequential topics, floral competitions, upcoming council events, and local amusements. In the pauses between remarks, he watched expressions, posture, and the delicate interplay of glances. The handkerchiefs had served their initial purpose. Now, in combination with social observation, they acted as subtle instruments for revealing priorities and concealed awareness. After half an hour, Purbright concluded the test with a casual reference to the school children's speculation about secret admirers. "Even the youngest observers contribute to our understanding," he remarked. "Curiosity, when nurtured, illuminates facets that polite adult conversation may obscure." The room absorbed the comment without dissent, yet the slight tension, micro-adjustments, and lingering attention indicated that those who had been involved or concerned had recognized the underlying probe. By late morning, Purbright had gathered a wealth of behavioral data. Squire's composure, Miss Cresswell's eagerness, Mrs. Penrose's self-conscious adjustments, and Mr. Thistle's mild unease had all been carefully registered. He noted patterns of interest, subtle alignment, and contradictions, storing them with previous observations of posture, glances, and timing. He reflected on the success of the exercise. No direct accusation had been made, no pressure applied beyond gentle, civil suggestion. Yet reactions had revealed priority, attention, and slight anxiety in ways formal inquiry could not. The town, unaware that it had been subtly tested, had demonstrated its tendencies, and Purbright now possessed a more refined map of social behavior upon which further deductions could be based. As the hall emptied and the townspeople returned to routine, the inspector remained quietly reviewing notes and aligning observations. The deliberate test had clarified relationships, highlighted discrepancies, and refined the understanding of motive without forcing confession. The next phase, he knew, would involve integrating these behavioral insights with the trivial anomalies, the handkerchiefs, displaced flowers, and subtle traces, to approach a resolution that was precise yet understated, in keeping with Flaxborough's delicate social equilibrium. By the time he departed, Purbright understood that the investigation had reached a crucial inflection point. Human nature, when gently prodded and carefully observed, had begun to reveal the contours of intention. The town, outwardly serene, had exposed fissures of curiosity, concern, and subtle rivalry, and the inspector, patient as ever, would use these insights to guide the inquiry toward the eventual revelation. By late afternoon, the town of Flaxborough exuded its customary calm, though beneath polite facades, anticipation had begun to hum faintly. Purbright had quietly arranged for a gathering in the Floral Society Hall, ostensibly to review upcoming exhibitions, but with a precise understanding that the moment had arrived to connect observation, subtle anomalies, and behavioral patterns. Attendees arrived punctually, each unaware that their minor gestures, attentive glances, and restrained expressions were about to be woven into a coherent explanation. Squires took his usual seat, maintaining polite composure, while Miss Cresswell positioned herself near the centre, pen poised, eyes flicking with anticipation. Mrs. Penrose arranged her shawl carefully, her expression indicating both curiosity and restrained apprehension. Even Mr. Thistle, who had spent the week monitoring floral arrangements with quiet indignation, displayed a subtle tension beneath his customary civility. Purbright, standing slightly apart, acknowledged each in turn with courteous nods, maintaining an air of detached observation while mentally assembling the final sequence of insights. "I am aware," Purbright began, in his soft yet deliberate tone, "that the recent occurrences, the handkerchiefs, the slight misplacement of flowers, and the ensuing speculation have captured your attention more than might have been expected for so trivial a matter. Yet, as in all social arrangements, there is significance in the smallest details." His gaze swept the room, not accusatory but measured, ensuring that each person understood the point without feeling singled out prematurely. He paused, allowing the words to settle, then gestured lightly toward the shelf where the second handkerchief had briefly rested. "These objects, seemingly trivial, have served as instruments for observation. One might consider them markers, prompting reflection, subtle action, or, in some cases, revealing latent tendencies." The statement, neutral yet pointed, prompted a faint stiffening among several attendees, most notably Squires, whose composure flickered for the briefest moment. Purbright continued, tracing the sequence of events with calm precision. The first handkerchief appeared during the flower show, provoking curiosity and minor consternation. Observers noted glances, hesitations, and micro-adjustments in posture, all of which suggested awareness and interest beyond the superficial. He allowed a slight pause before adding, "The second handkerchief, arriving days later, extended the observation, broadening the field and, crucially, revealing subtle patterns of behavior across multiple participants." Miss Cresswell's pen hovered, her eyes wide, while Mrs. Penrose's jaw tensed ever so slightly, and Mr. Thistle's fingers tapped minutely on the arm of his chair. Purbright observed these indicators with mild interest, noting that human behavior, left to respond naturally, had produced far more information than any direct interrogation could achieve. By careful observation, Purbright said, we can see that attention to trivial objects often correlates with broader inclinations, vigilance, pride, curiosity, or a subtle desire for social recognition. It is in these responses, rather than the objects themselves, that the truth resides. His voice remained civil, even genial, yet the weight of his words was unmistakable, encouraging reflection without coercion. He then turned toward Reginald Squires. Your presence during the initial incident, though perhaps coincidental, allowed observation of responses. You behaved with propriety, yet micro-adjustments indicated an awareness of attention beyond that of a casual bystander. This alone is neither culpable nor unusual. It merely provides context. Squires inclined his head slightly, maintaining formal composure, though a flicker of unease passed over his features. Purbright's gaze shifted to Mrs. Penrose. You, with your keen attention to detail and concern for decorum, revealed subtle engagement through posture and tone, demonstrating awareness of social balance and the importance of propriety. Mrs. Penrose's lips pressed together, acknowledging the observation without overt denial or comment. He finally addressed the less obvious participant, Miss Cresswell. And you, through meticulous note-taking and attentive observation, provided the most detailed record of patterns, glances, and hesitations. Your engagement, though entirely appropriate, revealed the manner in which curiosity can illuminate otherwise hidden dynamics. She shifted slightly, absorbing the remark with a mixture of pride and tentative embarrassment. Purbright allowed the room a moment of quiet reflection before concluding. Thus the incidents, the handkerchiefs, the minor floral displacement, and the ensuing attention have revealed more than was apparent at first glance. They have illuminated the interplay of human nature, subtle rivalry, and careful observation. The first suspect, while superficially compelling, was only one element within a broader tapestry of attention, interest, and personality. He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. The true lesson, he said gently, is that in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, even trivial actions produce meaningful reactions. The handkerchiefs themselves were not the focus, human nature was. By attending to subtleties, gestures, timing, and unspoken thought, we observe patterns that would otherwise remain concealed. A faint murmur circulated, almost imperceptible, as participants reflected on the manner in which minor provocations had elicited revealing responses. Squires exhaled quietly, his posture relaxing, while Miss Cresswell lowered her pen, a subtle acknowledgment of understanding. Mrs. Penrose rearranged her gloves, as if to reassure herself that civility had been maintained throughout. Purbright concluded the session with characteristic civility. No accusation beyond observation is necessary. The incidents have served their purpose, illuminating tendencies and priorities. The rest, I trust, will remain a matter of reflection, social awareness, and careful conduct. His tone suggested closure, yet remained gentle, leaving the room composed, thoughtful, and undisturbed in outward behavior. As the attendees departed, exchanging polite words and subdued smiles, Purbright remained, quietly reviewing notes and mental observations. The seemingly trivial provocations, the handkerchief's minor misalignments and subtle traces, had fulfilled their function. Through patience, observation, and careful, polite intervention, the layers of behavior, attention, and intention had been revealed. Flaxborough, outwardly serene, had once again demonstrated the richness of human subtlety, and the inspector, as always, had discerned the truth without need for overt confrontation or public scandal. By the time evening shadows lengthened across the cobbled streets, the hall was empty, the chairs neatly aligned, and the evidence of human nature fully registered. The incidents had concluded not with melodrama, but with quiet understanding, as befitted a town accustomed to civility and discretion. The town of Flaxborough resumed its habitual rhythms with a subtle sense of relief, though the echo of the Handkerchief incidents lingered in the polite awareness of its residents. Market stalls were arranged with care, flowers tended meticulously, and conversations at the bakery and post office carried the familiar undertone of civility, now informed by a quiet reflection on recent events. Purbright, arriving at his office in the mid-morning sun, noted the town's surface calm while mentally cataloguing the subtle adjustments in behaviour that the incidents had provoked. Mrs. Caldecott appeared at the Floral Society Hall, ensuring that chairs, display tables and bunting were restored to their precise order. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned that social equilibrium depended upon visible propriety, yet she allowed herself a faint smile when noting that the disruptions had passed without scandal. In the small, inward ways that Flaxborough measured civility, the town had succeeded. Purbright made a quiet visit to the stationer, Mr. Linton, who had resumed his methodical catalogue of receipts and correspondence. The stationer, while outwardly absorbed in his work, betrayed subtle signs of reflection, brief glances at the ledger, slight pauses in writing, and the occasional inward exhalation. These small details indicated contemplation of the events, and perhaps a private satisfaction in the orderly resolution, all of which Purbright noted with his customary calm attention. Miss Creswell, ever eager, had taken it upon herself to compile her notes into a careful summary. She had observed every micro-expression, hesitation, and glance during the flower show and subsequent gatherings. When Purbright visited her to review minor procedural matters, she demonstrated a quiet pride in the accuracy and thoroughness of her account. He praised her diligence with mild formality, noting that observation itself was an art that required patience, discretion, and judgment. In the council chambers, members discussed routine business, occasionally alluding to the flower show incidents in muted, careful language. The topics were framed around propriety, attention, and public perception rather than direct culpability. This allowed each participant to acknowledge the events without admitting personal intrigue or displaying overt curiosity. The subtleties, Purbright reflected, were far more revealing than any explicit declaration could have been. Even the younger residents, including Master Harper and his friends, had absorbed the lessons of observation and discretion. Their conversations in the schoolyard suggested a growing appreciation for careful attention, subtlety, and the awareness that minor actions often carried consequences disproportionate to their apparent significance. Purbright, passing near the playground, noted their gestures and tones with quiet satisfaction, aware that understanding human behavior often begins with small, early lessons in perception. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to his office to review his notes and mental observations. The handkerchiefs, the minor displacement of flowers, and the carefully observed responses had collectively illuminated the town's social dynamics, revealing patterns of attention, rivalry, curiosity, and propriety. Each person's subtle adjustments, glances, postures, hesitations, and careful words had contributed to the composite picture. He recorded these impressions with meticulous care, appreciating the interplay between trivial incident and human nature. The day moved toward evening, and the streets of Flaxborough bore the calm rhythms of routine. Shopkeepers arranged merchandise with habitual precision. The baker placed freshly baked bread on display. The postman made his rounds with quiet efficiency. The town appeared unchanged, yet beneath this calm, residents carried an awareness of the minor perturbations that had revealed character and priority. Purbright reflected that such equilibria, restored yet subtly altered, were the hallmark of his method: observation leading to insight without public spectacle or moralizing. In his office, he considered the significance of patience and measured attention. The apparent triviality of the handkerchiefs had provoked subtle revelations across multiple strata of the town. Micro-behaviors had exposed tendencies, priorities, and rivalries more clearly than overt questioning could have achieved. He acknowledged with mild satisfaction that the dual incidents had fulfilled their function. As instruments of reflection, they had allowed him to discern the underlying currents of motive and social interaction. As evening shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, Purbright made a final note. The town had resumed normal activity, yet the events had left an indelible mark on collective awareness. Residents had learned, in the quietest possible way, about attention, subtlety, and human nature. Social equilibrium had been restored, but it was a deeper, more informed equilibrium than before, one subtly reshaped by the interplay of observation, patience, and minor provocation. Finally, Purbright turned to his paperwork, the familiar calm of routine enveloping him. Letters, reports, and minor administrative tasks awaited attention, but the larger work, the careful disentangling of behavior, motive, and social subtlety, had been accomplished. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle resolved without disturbance, a town's civility maintained, and human nature discreetly illuminated. Flaxborough, outwardly serene, had emerged unchanged in appearance, yet enriched in understanding. The handkerchiefs were returned, the flowers aligned, and civility preserved, yet beneath the surface, every glance, gesture, and measured remark carried a new-found, subtle significance. The town had been observed, human nature interpreted, and equilibrium quietly affirmed. Purbright, at his desk, set down his pen and allowed himself a moment of reflective satisfaction. The incidents were concluded, the lessons absorbed, and the town's social fabric remained intact, subtly altered only in the depth of awareness its residents carried forward. With the office calm and the streets quiet, he prepared to resume the normal rhythms of work, confident that the truth had been discerned, the subtle patterns understood, and human behavior observed to completion.